1 in 3 Americans today suffers from chronic inflammation. 1 in 5 has been diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome. 1 in 10 lives with an autoimmune disease, and nearly 70% report digestive issues at least once a week. Now here's what's haunting. Go back 700 years to medieval Europe, and these numbers were virtually zero. Same human bodies, same basic genetics, same digestive systems. But the difference isn't a mystery, and it isn't your fault. The difference is in something that sits on your table every single morning, something that once built civilizations and now destroys your gut with every bite. The difference is wheat, but not just any wheat, the specific type of wheat, and what was done to it in a laboratory in 1961 that changed everything. A medieval peasant could eat bread 3 times a day for his entire life and never experience a single symptom of what we now call gluten sensitivity. You eat 1 sandwich and you're bloated for hours. This isn't because you're weak or because your body is broken. This is because the wheat in that sandwich is fundamentally, molecularly, catastrophically different from anything a human being ate for the previous 10,000 years of agricultural history. And if you want to keep discovering the knowledge that industry buries and history forgets, subscribe now to Medieval Histories and hit that notification bell, because what I'm about to show you about wheat will make you question everything you've been told about why you feel the way you feel. The grain that fed the Roman Empire, that powered the medieval world, that built the Gothic cathedrals and sustained the Crusades. That grain no longer exists in your supermarket. What replaced it is something else entirely. And the people who made this replacement knew exactly what they were doing. They just didn't care about the consequences because those consequences wouldn't show up for decades. And by then, they'd already made their fortune. This is the story of how the staff of life became the source of disease, and why your great-grandmother could eat all the bread she wanted while you can't touch a dinner roll without paying for it the next day. The statistics are staggering, and they're getting worse every year. Over 20 million Americans now identify as gluten sensitive, and that number has increased by 400% in just the last 2 decades. Celiac disease, which was almost unheard of before 1950, now affects 1 in every 133 Americans, and the rate is doubling every 15 years. But here's what's even more disturbing. Even people without diagnosed celiac disease or gluten sensitivity report feeling better, thinking clearer, and losing weight when they eliminate modern wheat from their diet. You've probably felt it yourself. That heavy, foggy feeling after eating pasta, the bloating after a sandwich, the fatigue that hits you an hour after toast for breakfast, the skin issues that flare up when you eat too much bread, the joint pain that seems to come from nowhere, the brain fog that makes you feel like you're thinking through cotton, the mood swings, the anxiety, the depression that gets worse after certain meals. If you're like most Americans, you've probably blamed yourself for these symptoms. You thought maybe you were eating too much, not exercising enough, not drinking enough water, getting too stressed. You tried elimination diets, you bought expensive probiotics, you went to doctors who ran tests that came back normal and then told you it was all in your head or that you just needed to manage your stress better. And all the while, you kept eating the bread because bread is supposed to be healthy, right? The food pyramid told you to eat 6 to 11 servings of grains every day. The USDA said whole wheat was good for your heart. Every diet expert said complex carbohydrates were essential for energy. So you kept eating it and you kept feeling worse, and nobody told you the truth. Nobody told you that what you're eating isn't actually the same food at all. Your grandfather ate bread his whole life without a single problem. He had toast for breakfast, a sandwich for lunch, dinner rolls with dinner, and he never once felt bloated or inflamed or foggy. What changed? Your body didn't change. Human digestion didn't evolve differently in 60 years. What changed was the wheat itself, and that change was deliberate, calculated, and catastrophically profitable for the companies who engineered it. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment and tell me, what city, what state, or what country are you watching from right now? I love knowing where each person in this community comes from, this community of people searching for knowledge that was buried. Leave your location down below, because what you're about to discover will completely change how you see wheat, bread, and every grain product in your kitchen for the rest of your life. You're going to learn why medieval people could eat massive amounts of bread without any of the problems we face today. You're going to learn the exact year when everything changed. You're going to learn the name of the man who engineered that change and why he did it. And you're going to learn how to identify real wheat from the inflammatory imposter that's currently marketed as healthy whole grain. This isn't just about bread. This is about understanding how an entire industry rewrote human biology for profit and then convinced you that your body's screaming alarm signals were your own personal failure. So drop that comment, let me know where you're watching from, and let's uncover the truth together. We're in the year 1243, in a village just outside of Canterbury in England. The sun is barely above the horizon, it's around 5:30 in the morning, and the air is sharp with the cold of early autumn. You're standing inside a stone cottage with a thatched roof, and the first thing you notice is the smell. It's the smell of bread baking, but not the smell of bread the way you know it. This is deeper, earthier, almost nutty, with a hint of something sweet and something fermented all at once. A woman named Margaret stands at a rough wooden table, her hands deep in a mass of dough that she's been working since before dawn. The dough is darker than what you'd expect, flecked with bits of grain and bran, sticky and alive under her fingers. Next to her is a wooden bowl covered with a cloth, and inside that bowl is a starter that her mother gave her when she married, and her mother received from her mother, going back generations further than anyone in the village can remember. This starter is a living culture of wild yeasts and bacteria that have been feeding on flour and water for possibly 100 years or more. Margaret takes a piece of this starter, mixes it with fresh flour that was stone ground just yesterday from wheat that was harvested from the field. You can see through the open door, adds water from the well, a pinch of sea salt, and begins the long process of fermentation that will take the next 12 to 18 hours. The wheat itself is called einkorn, one of the ancient varieties that humans first domesticated over 10,000 years ago. The kernels are small, the heads are delicate, and the plant yields far less flour per acre than modern wheat. But what it lacks in quantity, it makes up for in something else entirely. Something that Margaret doesn't have a scientific word for, but that she understands in her bones. This wheat doesn't make people sick. This wheat doesn't cause the strange stomach ailments that occasionally blow through the village when grain gets wet and moldy. This wheat, when fermented properly with the starter and given time, becomes bread that sustains her family through winters when there's little else to eat. Her husband, a stonemason working on the cathedral in Canterbury, eats 4 large slices of this bread with butter and cheese every morning before he leaves for work. He'll eat more at midday and more again in the evening. Some days, bread and ale make up 70% of his diet. And yet he's strong. His mind is clear. He works 12-hour days doing physical labor that would break a modern man, and he's never once complained of the bloating or the brain fog or the joint pain that plague modern bread eaters. The bread Margaret is making will feed her family for 3 days. It will stay fresh because the fermentation process creates natural preservatives. It will be dense and filling, so a single slice will satisfy hunger for hours. And it will be nutritious in ways that modern bread can't even approach, because the long fermentation breaks down anti-nutrients, releases minerals, and predigests complex proteins that would otherwise be hard for the human gut to handle. Margaret doesn't know the science, but she knows the result. She knows that bread made this way keeps her children healthy through the winter. She knows that bread made too quickly, without the proper fermentation, causes stomach troubles. She knows that wheat grown in certain soils tastes better and keeps longer. This knowledge has been passed down for so many generations that it's become instinct, woven into the rhythm of daily life as surely as the turning of the seasons. The science behind what Margaret was doing is extraordinary, and modern research has only recently begun to understand why her bread was so superior to what we eat today. The key lies in 3 factors: the type of wheat, the fermentation process, and the lack of industrial intervention. Let's start with the wheat itself. Einkorn wheat, the variety Margaret used, contains only 14 chromosomes. Modern wheat, the kind used in 99% of bread products today, contains 42 chromosomes. This isn't a small difference. This is a fundamental restructuring of the plant's genetic makeup. Einkorn and other ancient wheats like emmer and spelt have a simple gluten structure that the human digestive system evolved to handle over thousands of years. The gluten proteins in these ancient wheats are less complex, less inflammatory, and easier to break down. Modern wheat, by contrast, has been hybridized and crossbred so many times that its gluten structure is vastly more complex and contains proteins that humans never encountered until the 20th century. These new proteins, particularly a group called gliadin proteins, are what trigger the immune response that leads to inflammation, leaky gut, and autoimmune reactions in sensitive individuals. But here's what's crucial. Even people who can't tolerate modern wheat often have 0 problems with ancient varieties. Studies at the University of Florence in Italy have shown that patients with diagnosed gluten sensitivity can often eat ancient wheat varieties without any symptoms whatsoever. The difference isn't in the person, it's in the wheat. Now let's talk about fermentation. Margaret's 12 to 18-hour fermentation process with wild yeast and bacteria wasn't just traditional, it was biochemically essential. During long fermentation, several critical transformations occur. First, the wild yeasts and lactobacilli bacteria break down complex starches into simpler sugars, making the bread easier to digest and preventing the blood sugar spikes that come from eating modern quick-rise bread. Second, the fermentation process breaks down phytic acid, an anti-nutrient present in all grains that binds to minerals like iron, zinc, and calcium and prevents your body from absorbing them. Ancient bread making neutralized this compound. Modern bread making doesn't. Third, and most importantly, long fermentation breaks down gluten proteins into smaller peptides and amino acids that are far easier for the human gut to process. A study at the University of Alberta in Canada found that bread fermented for 12 hours or more had up to 70% less gluten than bread made with commercial yeast in just 2 hours. The bacteria literally eat the gluten. This is why Margaret's husband could eat bread 3 times a day without problems, while modern bread causes inflammation even in people without celiac disease. The bread he ate was predigested by bacteria before it ever entered his mouth. Then came 1961. That's the year everything changed. That's the year a scientist named Norman Borlaug introduced semi-dwarf wheat varieties that would eventually win him the Nobel Peace Prize, and, unknowingly, unleash an epidemic of chronic disease that's still growing today. Borlaug's goal was noble. He wanted to end world hunger. His method was to create wheat varieties that produced more grain per acre, grew shorter so they wouldn't fall over in wind, and could be harvested more efficiently with machines. He succeeded brilliantly. His new wheat varieties doubled and even tripled yields. They spread across the world. By 1980, over 90% of wheat grown globally was descended from Borlaug's high-yield varieties. Hunger decreased. Wheat became cheaper and more abundant than ever before in human history. Everyone celebrated. Nobody asked about the health consequences, because those consequences wouldn't become obvious for another 30 years. But here's what happened on a molecular level. To create these high-yield varieties, Borlaug and other scientists crossbred thousands of different wheat strains, including some wild grasses that had never been part of the human diet. They exposed seeds to chemicals and radiation to speed up mutations. They selected for traits like faster growth, higher gluten content to make fluffier commercial bread, and resistance to pests. And in doing so, they created a grain that was genetically unprecedented. This new wheat contained gluten proteins that had never existed before. It contained higher levels of amylopectin A, a superstarch that spikes blood sugar faster than table sugar. It contained new allergenic proteins that the human immune system had no evolutionary experience with. And because it grew so abundantly and so cheaply, it became the only wheat variety that made economic sense for farmers to grow. Ancient varieties like einkorn, emmer, and spelt couldn't compete. They yielded a third of the harvest. They were harder to process with modern machinery, and they didn't have the high gluten content that commercial bakeries needed to make light, fluffy, long-lasting bread. So they disappeared. Not all at once, but gradually, over the course of 20 years, they vanished from fields and then from markets and then from human memory. By 1985, if you wanted to buy bread in America, you were buying bread made from Borlaug's high-yield wheat, whether you knew it or not. And that's when the health crisis began. Celiac disease rates started climbing. Gluten sensitivity became a recognized condition. Irritable bowel syndrome became epidemic. Autoimmune diseases began their terrifying rise. And nobody connected it to the wheat, because we'd been eating wheat for thousands of years, so how could wheat suddenly be the problem? But it wasn't wheat. It was this new thing, this genetically novel grain that we were calling wheat, but that was as different from einkorn as a wolf is from a poodle. And here's the cruel irony. The food industry saw people getting sick from their product, and instead of going back to the wheat that didn't cause problems, they created an entire new market. They started selling gluten-free products at 3 times the price of regular bread. They replaced wheat flour with rice flour, cornstarch, and potato starch, plus a cocktail of gums, emulsifiers, and preservatives to make it hold together. And they charged desperate people premium prices for bread that was actually less nutritious than the wheat bread it replaced. Then they got even more clever. They saw people searching for ancient grains, looking for the wheat that didn't make them sick. And they started marketing ancient grain breads that still used modern wheat as the base, just with a sprinkle of spelt or kamut added for marketing purposes. They put sprouted grain on labels, knowing that most people didn't understand that sprouting modern wheat doesn't change its fundamental genetic structure. They sold whole grain bread and multigrain bread, implying health benefits while using the exact same inflammatory modern wheat that caused the problem in the first place. The bakery section of your grocery store is now filled with breads that cost $5 to $8 a loaf, all marketing themselves as healthier alternatives, and almost all of them are made from the exact same genetically modified high-yield wheat that's been causing inflammation since the 1980s. They're betting that you don't know the difference, and for decades, that bet has paid off spectacularly. Meanwhile, real einkorn flour, the wheat that humans ate for 10,000 years without problems, is nearly impossible to find in regular stores. When you do find it, it's in specialty health food stores, and it costs $10 to $12 a pound. The wheat that should be the standard has become the exotic exception, and the wheat that should have never entered the food supply has become the only option for 99% of consumers. The good news is that the knowledge wasn't lost. It was just buried under decades of agricultural industry propaganda and food science that prioritized profit over health. And now you know. Now you understand why you feel the way you feel after eating bread. Now you understand why your great-grandmother could eat all the sourdough she wanted while you can't touch a bagel without regret. And now you can make different choices. If you want to eat bread without inflammation, here's what you do. First, find real ancient grain flour. Look for einkorn, emmer, or spelt that's labeled as heritage or heirloom variety. Avoid anything that just says ancient grains without specifying which ones, because that's usually modern wheat with marketing. Second, if you're buying bread instead of making it, look for true sourdough that's been fermented for at least 12 hours. Real sourdough will list only flour, water, salt, and sourdough starter as ingredients. If it lists yeast, it's not real sourdough. It's regular bread with sourdough flavoring added. Third, do this simple test. Press your finger into the bread. If it springs back immediately and leaves no mark, it's made with modern high-gluten wheat and fast-rise yeast. If it stays compressed and feels dense, it's likely made the traditional way. Fourth, pay attention to how you feel. Eat a slice of real sourdough made from ancient wheat, and notice your digestion, your energy, your mental clarity over the next few hours. Then eat a slice of regular store-bought whole wheat bread and notice the same things. Your body will tell you the truth that the food industry tries to hide. This knowledge wasn't lost, it was just buried. And every time you choose real bread over industrial bread, you're rescuing wisdom that kept generations healthy when life was much harder. If this video opened your eyes to what the industry hides, hit that like button down below. It really helps the channel keep bringing these truths that few have the courage to tell. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now to Medieval Histories and hit that notification bell because every week we unearth more knowledge that they'd rather you never discovered. See you in the next video.